Hi, my name is Anna Swanson, and I'm the trade reporter for the New York Times. Thank you so much for joining this panel today. We're going to examine a fascinating and timely question. If digital realms imply further bifurcation of the internet, what do you think will happen next, and what will that mean for digital rights? For panelists today, I have with me Susan Ariel Aaronson, a professor of international affairs and director of the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub at George Washington's Elliott School of International Affairs. Min Jiang, who should be joining us shortly, professor of communication studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Patrick LeBlond, an associate professor at the University of Ottawa and a fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, and Mark Wu, vice dean for the graduate program in international legal studies and the Henry L. Stimson professor of law at Harvard Law School. We'll have at least an hour for our panelists to discuss, and then we will be opening it up for audience questions. So please feel free to put questions into the chat box as they occur to you throughout the presentations. We'd like to have a lively discussion. So I'll turn it over to our first panelist, Susan. Thank you.
Hi, and thanks so much for joining us today and for helping us to put forward this event. So Anna posed the question, what impact will these digital realms have on the internet and on digital trade? So you can move to my next slide. Okay, so basically, what are we talking about when we're talking about data realms? Every nation on the planet is just in the process of learning how to govern various types of data. And they understand that data is a resource and also a problem. But it's very difficult to govern various types of data. For example, personal data, public data, proprietary data. Two countries have comparative advantage in data because they have what you can say is economies of scale and scope for data. And those two countries are one developing country with a large domestic population, aka China, and then the United States, which was a country that had large firms that were able to acquire huge amounts of personal data. So what do I mean when I say data governance? Data governance is basically a process that allows firms, individuals, and governments to utilize a large supply of data, but also to ensure that that data is of good quality and that data is correct. And I have to say, the United States has lost its way. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we talk about a data realm, that means a country that either has a large population or lots of data firms. And so the United States has a decent sized population, right? 328-ish million, but that's nothing compared to China. But the United States has lots of firms with high computing power, which are better positioned to extract and use data. Why do I say that? Because these firms have been around for more than 20 years, and they understand how to extract data and utilize it. And that means they're better positioned to exploit large data sets, metadata. Okay. In the future, the value of data is likely to accrue to those firms that have scarce data or who use data in new ways, who understand, for example, how to exploit data, for example, to manipulate people's opinions. Okay, also more data leads to the possibility of a firm being better positioned to create new goods and services, right? The scholars in economics call this information asymmetries, right? If a country has these types of firms, and China and the United States do, it's better positioned to take advantage of these things. And this also applies between countries. Those countries that don't have these kind of firms are going to struggle to acquire data and to figure out how best to use data and how best to govern it. Next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. So just to give you a sense of what this means in the world today, US and Chinese firms collectively hold 75% of all the patents related to blockchain, 50% of all spending on the Internet of Things, 75% of cloud capacity, and 90% of market capitalization for the world's largest digital firms. So that's huge. Okay, next slide, please. So here are the 3 data realms. These are the largest countries or regions that compete for data and govern various types of data. So the EU, right? The EU basically says to other countries, yeah, you can have data flow among us, but when you're talking about personal data, these countries have to become quote unquote adequate. They have to show that they protect personal data in a manner that is equivalent to that of the EU. But they don't just focus on personal data. The EU's comparative advantage is in the governance of data, including public data. And what they do is they build on trust. They say that anyone can access public data, and it should be open and machine readable, which means that you can use a computer to easily analyze it. So right now, more than 12 countries are equivalent to the EU. And my gut is that that process won't be eased, but they're going to figure out a way to have other countries want to join the EU approach because it is built on trust. Now, the United States, I would say, has been a mess since WeChat and TikTok. The Trump administration policy towards data has been very inconsistent with longstanding US policies towards data, which was built on open data and the free flow of data. The irony is that the Trump administration has totally altered that because the United States is now essentially saying through those policies that it's going to very closely monitor and even ban foreign firms, in particular Chinese firms, that in their mind don't adequately protect personal data. Why? Because that's supposedly a national security risk. While India banned lots of Chinese apps, others are not following the US model, and it's not built on trust and it's less credible. So that's kind of worrisome. Then going to China, the Great Firewall, which is China's, it's an informal term to describe how China regulates data from abroad, may have helped to create huge firms with economies of scale and scope and data. But some argue, and I could not prove this to you, that China's quality of data is questionable. China is moving more, and Min will talk about this, so I won't steal her thunder, but they do, one could say that they are moving towards a stronger protection of personal data. Okay, next slide, please. So, how nations govern data, I think it's really important because it can affect the truthfulness of data, the supply of data, and what is essential in any polity, trust. You have to trust that your data is not misused. You have to trust that it is used in a transparent and accountable manner. You have to trust that the firm is using your data in a fair way under the law. So I would argue that trust in data is key to establishing markets and maintaining markets. And that in turn can lead to a comparative advantage in data governance. And I think people don't pay enough attention to this. So next slide, please. So data has become a national security issue. But the thing is, this is another thing that I think gets lost. Let's talk about various data-driven technologies such as AI. These are the results of scholarship, right? And scholarship, whether it's in AI or biochemistry, is a public good that we can use to solve problems that bedevil every country on the planet, whether it's COVID-19 or global warming. And so we would all be better off if data-driven innovation were global and not pursued as national. But I would say, unfortunately, the United States and other countries are making it national, and they are putting forward incentives that lead to this national approach to data governance and to data innovation. And that is most unfortunate. And I think will lead to less innovation. So the US as a case study. Okay, so just a little bit on this. The US argued, even though we have no personal data protection law at the national level, it became very clear after 2013, and I've written a lot on this issue, why did data become a national security issue? Frankly, in my mind, it's because we don't adequately protect metadata and we don't really think about data sets and how they can be mixed, and do we need to regulate that? So starting in 2013, we realized after the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, there was a data breach and lots of national security data was lost, that those data sets could be mixed with other data sets that were also stolen, such as Anthem, Sony. And so starting in 2018, under the 2018 Defense Authorization Act, which reviewed, the US government started to look at this purchase of TikTok. And eventually the US government under Trump decided that these companies must sell the US operations. So I really, honestly, I'm totally confused as to where we are with this. And in fact, my slides are out of date. But basically, I would say that this policy is inconsistent. Either if data is a national security issue, then the first thing we must do is protect personal data. So I'm saying the argument is fueled on logic. Next slide, please. Okay. Now here's the Trump administration perspective, which is that China's big platforms grew up under this great firewall where they were protected and nurtured. And so that's unfair competition, right? So I'm looking at this now from a trade perspective rather than a national security perspective. They saw China as good at stealing, as well as buying legally, buying firms, buying data sets, and creating apps that can accrue personal data. So they look at the excellent artificial intelligence of TikTok, and they see TikTok, and many apps are this, we need to be honest about this. They saw it as basically a misuse of AI to obtain all sorts of personal data about German, American, Canadian young people and their likes and dislikes. And you can take that data, cross it with other data sets, and gain new insights into the behavior of people. And so again, AI has become not a tool to solve wicked problems, but a tool to get access to all sorts of personal data that can be mixed to develop insights into how people behave and consume. And that's how metadata became a national security issue. Next slide. But you gotta be consistent if you want other peoples to respect your position and to follow it. And the US no longer leads and is undermining its own data realm because it is showing that its commitment to the rule of law, predictability, and openness doesn't matter. Can I go back to that slide, please? Thank you. So what I worry about is the United States is becoming more like China in the face of the national security threat. And it's going to have huge implications for digital trade. So what's happening on digital trade at the WTO and through regional and bilateral trade agreements, the US has been pushing for the free flow of data, whether that's public data or personal data, with certain exceptions. So I would argue that if the United States wants to expand its data realm and have other nations adopt similar approaches, it should go back to what it was, which was a recommitment to the rule of law, to predictability and openness. My gut is that won't happen under Trump, but let's hope we move on to a different administration. Thanks for hearing me out.
Thank you so much, Susan. Let's move on to Min's presentation.
Thank you. To pick up the thread of discussion from Susan, I will provide a brief background to China's recent data policy development, highlight its differences from the US and EU approaches, and discuss a few implications of a bifurcated internet for international data regulation and trade. For context, it's worth noting that a defining story of our time is China's rise against America's relative decline in the past 4 decades. Driven by the economic growth in China, China's large internet population now 900 million, more than those of the US and EU combined, is an important factor in the remaking of global geopolitics surrounding data technology and trade policies. Next slide, please. Over the past 2 decades, we've witnessed the gradual bifurcation of the internet's ecosystems, with one end centered around the US and the other end centered around China. Fueled by an internal market and global trade, China has developed its own technological ecosystem, independent from the one centered around Silicon Valley. In fact, it is the only system that can challenge Silicon Valley. By 2015, China has already surpassed the United States in a number of key areas, including being the world's largest e-commerce market, smartphone market, and having the fastest supercomputers. In every category from e-commerce to social media, China has its own national champions. Some of those have become quite successful internationally, such as Huawei, ZTE, Alibaba, Tencent, and TikTok, most of which are now banned by the Trump administration in the United States. So currently, the world's data realms are dominated by 3 models. The Chinese model is state-centric, where the government plays a pivotal role in building digital infrastructure, setting development agenda, and regulating data flows. The US approach is market-centric, largely based on US internet giants collecting and selling user data for advertising dollars. Scholars argue that the US model represents a new stage of capitalism, surveillance capitalism. Some others argue that it resembles a new form of colonialism, that is data colonialism. The EU is trying to offer something different that is more human-centric, I believe. It tries to restore the dignity and integrity of the data subjects through the GDPR, privacy and data protection framework. Although EU doesn't yet have a comprehensive technological ecosystem that can challenge the incumbent US and Chinese systems. Next slide, please. Since 2014, China has adopted a systematic approach to revamp its digital policies. Structurally, the Cyberspace Administration of China was established to centralize its cyber policy making. Also in 2014, the State Council of China announced an ambitious plan to establish a social credit system to evaluate the trustworthiness of its citizens, businesses, social organizations, and state agencies. 2015 witnessed the unveiling of several industrial plans, including Internet Plus Plan, One Belt, One Road initiative, which has a digital Silk Road component, and Made in China 2025 plan, all aimed at improving China's technological capacity and exporting it overseas through trade. In terms of legislation, China passed the cybersecurity law in 2017 that laid the foundation for its comprehensive digital policy making. It also passed the Personal Information Security Specification, known informally in China as China's GDPR, although this specification itself is a technical standard lacking law enforcement power. In the following year, China passed the e-commerce law last year. 2 specific measures were proposed to address data security both inside China and cross-border data flow. Next slide, please. In terms of international data trade, a few aspects of China's data policies are worth noting. Number 1, a serious effort has been made in China to define personal data and important data to require either their storage inside China or a security assessment before exporting that data. Personal information now in China refers to information that can identify the data owner, such as a person's name, ID, address, etc. What important data means still remains unclear, and it's broadly associated, quote, national security, economy development, and social interests. So the difficulty lies in operationalizing these terms so that they can actually be implemented. Second, although China doesn't have a comprehensive set of privacy laws, its new personal data protection policies try to be GDPR compatible. However, the Chinese government won't give up access to or control over user data, a giant loophole in the law allows authorities to actually collect personal information without user consent, and the government can inspect network operators and demand them to turn over user data. Third, network operators are the main targets of cross-border data regulation in China, unlike the EU approach that mandates a standard contract between network operators and data recipients for international transfer of personal data. China doesn't demand it, but instead focuses specifically on security assessment for network operators. And for foreign operators handling personal data and important data, China tries to territorialize data and legal responsibilities by demanding number one, data localization, but also asking foreign operators to have legal representation inside China so the Chinese laws would apply to them. Next slide, please. In terms of the challenges ahead, in my mind, these challenges are mainly geopolitical. The confrontation, as we heard from Susan, between China and the United States has led to both a trade war and a technology cold war that forces nations to pick which side of the new Berlin Wall people want to live in. And China has built its Great Firewall since the 1990s, but now, as Susan has indicated, the Trump administration is trying to seal the wall, so to speak, from the other side, putting a significant dent in the expansion of Chinese tech firms. The international system and digital trade are now under the influence of forces pulling them in opposite directions. Renationalization on the one hand and internationalization on the other hand. Various countries are trying to sort of best position themselves in digital trade and data trade by negotiating through trading blocks, trade blocks and international standard organizations. Whether such efforts can be successful remains to be seen. There does exist the need to develop international trade agreements and standards to handle international digital trade, perhaps in the form of a World Data Organization modeled after WTO. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to our Q&A and continue the conversation.
Great, thank you so much. Next, we'll go to Patrick to talk to us about the environment in the EU.
Thank you, Anna. We'll just wait for my slides to show up. Right. All right, so to start off with, I think it's important, and it's already kind of been mentioned, but it's important to think about cross-border data and national data protection in terms of a trilemma. Susan at the beginning talked about trust and the importance of trust, and one of the issues is that, a little bit like in other areas of globalization and cross-border economic flows, is that countries face a trilemma in the sense that if they want to focus on national data protection, whether it's to focus on people or to focus on the state, as Min nicely put it, then they sort of have a choice. If they want to allow free data flow across borders, well, then that means that you're going to have different national data protections and different types, and one country has to recognize that maybe their citizens' data or their residents' data is not going to be as well protected in another jurisdiction. So therefore, it actually challenges or threatens trust that people might have in terms of their personal data or sometimes business data flowing beyond the borders. And that's certainly one of the main issues that the EU is preoccupied with, as we saw in the Schrems II decision, where it was very concerned about access to personal data by US government authorities, and as a result said that the privacy shield was not in line with US law and certainly GDPR requirements. And the only way to solve this data trilemma is basically to sort of extend, if you want, a national data protection to make it a more supranational data protection, where within that realm, if you want, and beyond borders, you can have free data flow, but everyone follows the same rules, enforcement is the same, and therefore, people and businesses trust the data that flows across the borders. And in a way, this is exactly what the EU has done with its GDPR, and before that with its data protection directive, where it basically makes sure that the same rules apply all across the union. And then, as we'll see, when now it wants to allow other countries to basically, or companies to export data outside of the EU, it's trying to make sure that those countries, or at least those firms, follow basically EU rules. So in that sense, there is trust for people, so they don't have to necessarily consent on every time their data is being exported. So next slide, please. So this is in a way how the EU resolves this data trilemma, is basically to say, okay, we want to have our national data protection. We want certainly to focus on trust, but at the same time, it would be nice for digital trade and trade in general and conducting business to have data flow across borders. So they started within the EU, and then now they're trying to kind of extend their realm to other jurisdictions to make sure to say, well, if your businesses want to do business with the EU, if they want to access personal data in the EU, whether it's a newspaper that wants to basically sell its service to EU citizens, well, then they have to abide by EU law. Otherwise, they won't be able to. And ideally, you can have a sort of adequacy decision that the European Commission gives to another country, and that says, well, all your businesses within that country, if your laws are adequate or in line with those of the EU, then data can flow across borders without problem especially for personal data. So it's in that sense that it has resolved the trilemma within the EU, and now it's trying to extend it beyond the European realm. And in a way, it's kind of forcing now the US with the Schrems II decision to say, well, no, the Privacy Shield actually doesn't ensure that EU personal data is protected in the United States. So therefore, kind of pushing Americans or the United States government to adopt laws that would be in line with those of the EU. So you're seeing a kind of to again go back to what Min was saying, a geopolitical battle where the EU is using its sort of standards as best practices and using its realm and the fact that it's such an important economic player internationally to push it. And even as Min mentioned, China is trying to increase its privacy standards to along GDPR, although obviously the fact that the state can intervene and collect data without any consent obviously is an infringement of EU rules, which is exactly on the basis for which the Court of Justice of the European Union struck down the Privacy Shield between the EU and the United States. When it comes to business data or non-personal data, certainly the EU has not gone as far. They certainly allow data localization requirements for non-personal data, mostly business data, for each EU member states when it deals with third countries. So within the EU, obviously, data has to freely flow because we're talking about obviously a single market, and they're certainly pushing for a single digital market within the European Union. Next slide, please. So to basically adopt a different focus than the one that Susan and Min presented, if we see kind of the two extremes, where on one hand is completely independent national data regulation and at the expense, in a way, of free cross-border data flows, you have China, right, with its cybersecurity law and other laws that and policies that it has in place that Min nicely talked about. On the other, as Susan talked about, the approach that the US has followed is very much not to regulate data within the United States, and then through free trade agreements, which it had done first with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, then before the Trump administration abandoned it, but certainly in the USMCA, the language is that data must flow freely across borders. And that's kind of the approach that is followed. And the EU is sort of in between those two approaches, where it still wants cross-border data flows, but in a way it's kind of imposing its own national data regulation onto others. So it's a little bit different than the approach, and I think it fits nicely with what Min was talking about in terms of kind of focus on the state, market, and sort of the humans or people going forward. Next slide, please. So the main tool in a way that the EU has been using to extend its realm is the so-called adequacy, right? It only applies to personal data for now, but we could see potentially in the future that it would also apply to non-personal data. And there are a number of countries right now that are considered adequate by the European Commission, although this adequacy obviously gets revised usually after 5 years. A number of these countries are actually undergoing revisions, especially with the adoption of the GDPR in May 2018. Canada is one of them, and it's actually presenting interesting situations where Canada has actually taken commitments under the USMCA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership with the US and other countries, and potentially those could contravene in a way the GDPR requirements. So whether Canada will be able to kind of square the circle remains to be seen. Obviously, the UK is facing the same situation. Right now, because it follows the GDPR, it's still adequate, but as of January 1st, 2021, unless there is a deal with the UK, with the EU, which now doesn't seem to be on the cards, technically it would no longer be adequate, and data would not be able to flow between the UK and the European Union, which would present a huge issue for UK businesses doing business in the EU, especially financial services firm. And as we know, as I've talked about with the Schrems II decision, now the US is sort of in a, I don't want to use the no man's land, no person's land, because of this recent decision. Some companies are continuing to flow data, basically because no one has told them not to do so, but legally, it's not clear whether they're actually able to do it. So there's a lot of discussions as to trying to negotiate a new deal between the EU and the US. That remains to be seen. Next slide, please. So in a way, now the EU wants to build even more, focusing on trust and build on the GDPR. It's certainly gone, it's now putting together a Digital Services Act package, which would regulate very much content on social media, allow businesses or force businesses actually to share data between themselves, so that in a way they could no longer hoard data and in a way have a competitive advantage as such. So it's focusing on really trying to create a level playing field. At the same time as content would be regulated, it's actually passed a law that allows, in a way, for copyrighted material to be licensed, so that, again, a lot of the social platforms cannot just use the material for free and pass it on, saying, well, you know, it's not us who's putting on this material, it's mostly our customers on those platforms. So now they would have to secure copyrights and pay for those copyrights. And so in a way, the EU is really adopting an approach that is not just focused, interestingly enough, as Min said, that it's kind of focused on the human, but in fact, it's very much market-based, where it wants to create more competition, whereas what we're seeing in the US is actually increasingly, yes, it's market-based, but a sort of anti-competitive market with very large firms dominating and increasing their domination. In a way, one possible solution down the road that we could see is for the EU, given in a way the digital nature of trade, especially in services, where maybe people who consume a service outside of the EU, whether in Canada and the US or in other parts of the world, could say, well, in fact, we would want to have be protected by the sort of the EU's rules, because they are the best ones, and it could almost be under contractual basis, as we see sometimes for investments or other contracts, where they say, okay, the laws that will apply in this contract are those of, let's say, the United States or the UK or I don't know, Switzerland, for instance. But you could do the same with digital contracts, right? If you want to do business with the New York Times, you're I don't know, in Canada, could you say to the New York Times, you know, I'm happy to do business with you, but instead of using US laws, I'd like to be protected by EU laws. Otherwise, I'm not going to do business with you. Is that something that could happen? So could the EU provide a sort of digital consumption visas for non-EU individuals. So maybe that kind of pushing as a market-based solution is something that the EU might try to push forward. It would be interesting to see, but it opens up in a way a lot of possible opportunities as such. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Great. And finally, let's go to Mark Wu to talk to us about how these three different realms are interacting.
Thanks very much, Anna. And I also want to thank the Graduate Institute for hosting us today, as well as Susan for her leadership in putting all this together. I was asked to speak about the latter part of our session's title, which is, what does this mean for the rest of the world? So we've heard about the three different data realms that are emerging. There certainly is an interchange between them. So this is not one of these three distinct splinter nets, but the question is whether or not those walls that are going up between them are getting higher and higher, and what that will mean going forward in terms of how the rest of the world then seeks to interact with it. And what I want to suggest as a framework for us to think about this discussion is to say there are 5 different categories that we might be able to put countries in who are outside of the US, EU, and China. And at a high level, we can think of this as 2 different big buckets. One of them are a set of countries and a set of governments as well as civil societies who say we should just sit on the sidelines. This is still just too early in the game for us to think about how do we shape or even play with these types of giants. There are a lot of these geopolitical as well as domestic political economy factors that are in play, and it's not worth us tying our hands in one way, shape, or form. So I want to suggest that's one category, and there are 2 distinct camps within that category. And then there's a second category, which are a set of countries that are playing ball, and they're playing ball in lots of different ways. They think it's more important to be, now I'm going to mix my sports metaphors here, but they think it's more important to be on the pitch, right, and engaged in the game, even if you're not a striker and you're just sort of guarding on the sidelines. It's more important to be there and to be involved in shaping those types of rules. And I want to suggest that there are 3 distinct types of approaches that countries are taking in that realm. Those 3 are not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? Some of them are doing just only one of those. Some of them are doing all 3 of those. But by and large, I want to then suggest, right, that if we think back to it, there are 5 different categories. 2 of which fall into on the sidelines, right? So if you think about this from a sports standpoint, these are countries that are standing on the sidelines, and 3 of which are countries who are on the pitch, but they're doing different things while they're on the pitch. Okay, so let me touch a little bit about the countries on the sidelines. The countries on the sidelines, and by this I mean they're not actively engaged in the thrust of rulemaking, standard shaping, or anything in any of the international organizations, whether we're talking about the WTO, the OECD, the G20, or the ISO, ITU, and so forth, right? These are a set of countries that are essentially looking at it and saying, I don't know what good choices I have. Because on the one hand, I'm locked into a set of major Chinese and American large platforms, and I'm making infrastructure choices today which are going to bind me for the next couple of decades, which are largely from a cost standpoint, have traditionally been US European, but from a cost standpoint are increasingly migrating to Chinese choices. Now you can balance all of this as long as you simply trust, and we go back here to the key word, trust, right, in these private platform players, as well as in the infrastructure that you're putting in place, that there's nothing that's necessarily siphoning off anything or taking advantage of this to exploit your citizens. And I think what the countries on the sidelines are facing is a dilemma to say, is this more akin to the IP debates that played out in the past with TRIPS and so forth, where we learned over the course of time that wasn't necessarily the case, right? That large firms served their own oligopolistic interests, that they were able to reap certain comparative advantages that we've not been able to overcome, right? Which had negative public interest implications. Or is this more akin to the financial sector, where again, if we looked at the financial sector, there is a set of pipes that are largely laid, right, by these major powers. There's a set of credit systems. There's a set of transactions that are largely shaped in these types of currencies, but they don't necessarily have as large of a national spillover effect, although for countries who are facing macroeconomic crises, you could certainly argue otherwise, right? But they don't sort of extend on a day-to-day level. They sort of extend more on a crisis type of situation. Now, I think that's a set of common issues facing these countries, facing all countries, but these countries have said these are such big issues, I don't know what to make about it. I should stand on the sidelines for this. And what I want to suggest about these countries on the sidelines, there really are two categories, and we can't tell them apart on the outside. There's a set that are convinced they should stay on the sidelines. And so, in other words, many of these rules may extend on the most favored nation basis, so they should just remain on the sidelines. And there are others who are essentially remaining on the sidelines in order to bargain for something in another realm that's not necessarily data. And particularly, this may be in agriculture, this may be special differential treatment, other types of trade-related issues, and they're remaining on the sidelines in order to have some type of leverage on those. And what I want to suggest is really, without knowing what's going on inside the capitals, it's hard to tell which of these two categories the countries in the sidelines are on. Now, let me spend a few minutes about the other countries, right, that are not in the sidelines. And I think there are three different dimensions that are worth diving into for those. The first, of course, and I expect many of the attendees here are very familiar with what's going on at the WTO itself. And so here we do see, right, the joint statement initiative, which many of us were involved in launching at Davos, which is now chugged along, which we do expect to see some progress on, even with all the other WTO initiatives stalled. There is forward momentum on this realm. But I think the question here is still a question about scope and to what extent this is going to touch on other elements of e-commerce, such as e-signatures, consumer trust, consumer privacy, payment systems, those types of, right, sort of what we could call e-commerce trade facilitation issues, as opposed to true data issues, including data flows, inspections of algorithms, and those types of issues. And I think that's still to be worked out. But in many ways, I think some are looking at it to say this is going to be more of a least common denominator type of agreement that everyone can agree upon, that will look more akin to what we see as the TFA, right, in the digital realm. And the question then being, are the big powers who want something that's more of a high standard agreement, are they content to let that live and to shape those high standards elsewhere, or will they insist on that being played out inside the WTO? And I think the other question here is the WTO has some institutional interest to say, is it content to have that type of low common denominator type of agreement? The second realm, second type of approach that's already been touched on is, of course, the free trade agreements. And here, notably, right, you have the USMCA, you have the CPTPP, you also have the US-Japan Digital Partnership Agreement, but you see agreements that are embedded inside trade agreements that touch on these types of data issues. And they also touch in various forms on other types of agreements that have been put forward by a number of other countries, Australia, Singapore, Korea, and the like, right, that are really pushing a set of features on e-commerce data and so forth going forward. And the last approach that I want to highlight for those who are engaged is a third type of approach, which we saw premiere this year, which is more of a modularized approach known as the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. So this was put forward by three countries, Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand. All of them have signed on to, all of them, I want to highlight, right, are actively involved at the WTO itself, have signed on to free trade agreements. But what they've done is, and I think they would characterize it this way, right, is to try to make this into modularized, manageable chunks that other people, other countries, right, can take, build into their own domestic systems that allow for some type of integration. They could expand on that. They could take those modules as a whole. They could sort of tweak those modules to fit the domestic context. But what they see is this DIPA framework as serving as a set of easy plug-and-play modules that allow for an interface between these different types of data realms. So that's a quick summary of how I would characterize the rest of the world. Like what's going on with the US, EU, and China, a lot of this is in flux, and a lot of this is responsive to what's going on between the US, EU, and China, as each of them sort of stakes out its data governance strategy in different realms, which were discussed earlier by our other experts on this panel. So thanks very much.
Great. Well, thank you so much. These are really fascinating presentations. I'd like to invite the audience once again to submit questions in the chat or Q&A functions. We do have a couple questions, but we'd love to have your input for a lively discussion. The first question was addressed to Susan Aaronson, although I think we could open it up to Patrick LeBlond as well and other panelists if you like. The question is, if you think trust plays a role in creating comparative advantage in data and data services, do you think the EU is right in pursuing its current approach vis-a-vis developing an industrial policy for its cloud and data sector? So Susan, would you like to address that first? And then other panelists, please feel free to jump in with your thoughts.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for that thoughtful question. Basically, I would say that the EU approach has both positives and negatives, like anything else in this world. And what I don't like about it is they use, in my mind, bullying to get other countries to become adequate. But I also think that they tend to have a greater focus on capacity building. And regarding data governance, that is going to be key. Mark Wu brought up a model that I think we should be paying attention to, which is the deeper model. Not only because this trade agreement, and some say, and it is called the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. So even that terminology, I think, is focused on building trust. As Mark said, you can take parts of it and put it in your own trade agreements. But what I love about it is if you read it, it's not about facilitating the free flow of data to enable businesses to prosper. It's about saying that trust is at the root of all good governance. Without trust, we are nothing, right? We can't have a relationship with one human being, let alone 2 billion more. And that's what I like about it. So it's, how do you build trust in this digital economy where you and I don't know each other? But I need to know that when you write a review on Amazon about hair color, what you're saying is truthful. I hope that answered the question. Patrick?
Yeah, I can build on that. Great. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Anna. I think certainly in light of the question, it seems that as I've mentioned, that's exactly what the EU seems to be pursuing and what they're calling for, recognizing in a way or trying to address a lot of the complaints that are out there when it comes to the use of data, the collection, the difficulty. With the sort of more North American approach based on consent, right, where people, if they want to consume a digital service, you have to click, you consent, but what are you really consenting to? No one reads, these long legalese form telling you, oh, how are we going to use your data? So in a way, the EU is using its state power to actually protect people and protect in a way its digital market and saying, well, this is we're not necessarily interested in building these big firms like the Facebooks and the Googles and the Apples. It's still the case still has to be made that that approach, as some are saying, that the EU's approach actually undermines innovation, undermines economic development. I think that case still has to be made that it is actually so, because on the other hand, it is pushing for innovation when it comes to data protection, when it comes to new technologies that might allow, for instance, for data to be shared, right? The EU is the jurisdiction that has pushed the most for open banking, for instance. Well, still, that requires technology to allow for people to move their banking operations from one financial institution to another easily. How to also to make sure that they can easily have access to their data, and it leads to innovation in terms of technologies with digital identities, potentially protecting people. So I think the case still has to be made that the sort of free market approach that the US has been pursuing is the better one, and obviously, as we've seen on the China side, even kind of state involvement doesn't prevent, in a way, the buildup of very large firms. So there's nothing to say that over time there could not be European big firms. But I think also from the Europeans' perspective, there's not this belief that having, these national or European champions, even though there is some discussions around that, is actually good for people, for consumers, for the economy. On the contrary, everything that they're doing now is all focused on antitrust, is all focused on improving competition, which no one else seems to be doing. And maybe Susan referred to bullying. Well, maybe it is a form of bullying, but so are the other realms, bullying. Just didn't really go into it, but China is doing the same with the digital Silk Road, right? It's kind of the same idea. Well, you want to be within our realm. Well, then we'll extend our great firewall to your country, and you government will give you all the sort of security technology so that you can control your population and know what's going on. And our companies will now be able to offer services to your people, and that's often kind of overlaid to the Belt and Road Initiative and things like that. So I think the issue of trust might actually be, as I mentioned, ultimately the thing that will allow the EU to be to have a competitive advantage compared to other approach. Ideally, what I'd like to see is let people choose. If you do what I'm talking about in terms of consumer digital rights or digital consumer rights or visas, well, let the people choose under which regime they would like to be protected. That would be, to me, the best market approach. That let's run the experiment. Let's see if people, if they are given a choice, what they would choose actually, which laws they would like to be protected by. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great, really interesting. I just wanted to check if Mark or Min wanted to jump in on that. Patrick bringing up the idea of the digital Silk Road as a way of propagating China's standards. I thought that was very interesting. Or I can just move on to other questions because we do have others as well.
Sure, Anna, I can chime in real
Okay.
quick here. It's interesting. I think all these models are out there, but now we're in this period to see how they are getting implemented. Even EU's GDPR rules have faced challenges in implementation. When EU members, sign up to GDPR, but they can also, within their own nations, legislate in ways that that probably make the implementation of GDPR incredibly difficult. We know Ireland for a long time has been this haven for large US internet giants. And if Ireland is not really complying with EU's rules, and that leaves a really giant loophole for exploitation. So the EU's rules are really interesting for us to watch and see. And we would be really interested to see how different countries adopt GDPR or modify GDPR and integrate elements of it. I personally would be interested to see if EU would also adopt more aggressive, perhaps, industrial policies to push in technologies in ways that are highly GDPR compatible. Because if United States and China are not interested in pursuing these strategies, then that leaves EU a really interesting place to, I think, play in this realm. And in terms of digital Silk Road initiatives, it's part of the component in the China's sort of ambitious plan to expand trade globally. And there are components, a lot of components for surveillance, as Patrick mentioned. There are also other components for practically promoting Chinese network products and digital products overseas. It is an approach China has taken that it's approaching different countries one at a time to form a bilateral agreements. And so how these agreements are shaped up in the future are still things to be seen. And this is a decade-long project, and China is playing a very long game.
Okay, great. I do have a couple more questions here. First, we had a logistical question. Someone was wondering if you'd be able to share your slides. So I think, I'm sure the panelists would be open to that if you want to reach
I
out.
was going to say, we'll put them on the Hub website, and maybe we can convince Global Trade Week, and maybe they'll be featured in the New York Times in a year or so.
Definitely.
How about that?
All right, great. Well, thank you so much. We did have another question here focused specifically on Africa. Given that the US and China, and also even the EU, already have comparative advantage in data governance, what possibilities are there for global coordination that is favorable to African countries? And what do African countries need to be doing to ensure this? And Mark talked about it. I think I'll just broaden this a little bit too. Mark talked about this a little bit, but do any of you want to add any more thoughts about what these data realms imply for smaller nations that are not the US, the EU, China, or the role that multilateral institutions or bilateral and regional trade pacts will play in this? But let's try to address the original question as well, focused on African countries.
I think I can give that a try. Because it's something that we're at the Hub are working on. So first, let me say, you probably know that in the current trade agreement among African nations, they allegedly are going to discuss digital trade. And so, and obviously that will include the governance of personal data and possibly open public data, get data held by government entities or paid for by the government. Secondly, if I may take it more broadly, the World Bank Annual Development Report is focusing on data and data governance and data as an asset. And that should be out sometime late October. And I can point you to the website. I'll put that in the chat in a second if you're not familiar with that. Thirdly, we just got a grant to examine the governance of data across, we can only do 40 countries. The grant isn't that big. But so we're going to look at 40 countries and compare the governance of various types of data to get a sense of, even though it's hard to say, what does good data governance look like, right? That's normative, but let's get a sense of, how are nations such as Rwanda or Indonesia building data-driven sectors? Because they clearly are. And so what role does governance play in that? And ultimately, trust cannot be measured, right? But you can ask people if they trust that their data is protected. So one thing that I think is important to look at is, there's sort of the supply side of governance. That's what governments are doing. But what does public opinion polls tell us about how people feel in these countries about how their data is governed? Do they feel comfortable saying things online or wherever? And that, in my mind, coming full circle to the first question, is where it's at. Ultimately, the digital economy is nothing without you and I feeling comfortable in it. And you can have all the great firms in the world, but if the people start to revolt against them, it's kind of a funny thing, like I would say, and Min should comment on it, in China, people do feel comfortable generally dissing things that are going on, not by the government, but by firms. And, in the United States and the EU, in contrast, is a really interesting thing. Almost everybody, like I'm not on Facebook as far as Susan Aaronson being on. I know I'm monitored there, but, people have not abandoned the companies that treat them so badly.
All right, Mark, did you want to jump in here? And then we'll go to Patrick as well.
Sure. Let me just address the panelists' question. The question posed to us, which is saying, what does Africa need to do? Right. So I think those of us in the trade realm are oftentimes stuck on sort of creating norms, standards, rules, and so forth. And certainly, I think what's going on with the next phase of the AFCFTA is an important element on that realm. But what I want to focus on are what do they need to do outside of the trade realm, or at least the trade agreements realm, because I think that's actually what's critical. And I just want to touch on three in particular. I think one is the infrastructure gap and the infrastructure deficiency. And certainly when it comes to what's necessary to support high data-driven, innovative ecosystem clusters, we see Africa lagging. And we've seen in the mobile space, when you can catch up on infrastructure, African entrepreneurs are actually extremely innovative. But it was only in the first case, right, when we were talking about cell phones, when that infrastructure gap closed, that we saw that type of innovation. And so I think there's certainly an innovation gap in much of Africa. I don't want to suggest the whole entire continent, but much of Africa that needs to be addressed. And that's a connectivity issue with regards to the global internet as a whole, but especially in terms of connectivity speeds between African countries. So that leads me then to my second point, which is I think African countries have to ask themselves from a scale economy perspective, scale economies do matter in the data realm. And so are you going to form some form of a regional scale economy, or are you going to align with one of the types of three approaches? And I think African leaders, because of how dispersed the continent is, are struggling with this and thinking about, does that need to be continent-wide versus, right, Southern Africa, East Africa, each of the traditional arrangements, should this be AU-led, and so forth. But I think there needs to be some decisions that are made on that realm about whether or not you want to do something at a regional level. And I think even just the challenges the EU has faced compared to US and China have shown how economies scale are very difficult, even once you create them, to manage from that type of standpoint. And then the third thing is it really needs to bolster its regulatory oversight capabilities. Africa is starting to catch up now in terms of getting laws on the books, but getting laws on the books is just the first step. The more important step is having folks who are able to monitor and then to take effective enforcement actions, and to have companies actually respond to those in a productive manner, as opposed to say, okay, if that's what you're going to do to me, I'm out. So I think those would be the three that I would suggest what the continent really needs to focus on. And again, when I talk about the continent, recognizing that where Nigeria is in a very different position than, say, a Burkina Faso.
Okay, and then let's go to Patrick and then Min as well here.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, so in a way, Mark stole a bit of some of the things I wanted to say. Focusing on the implementation, I was going to give the example of Benin, which basically adopted the GDPR as is into its laws. So it's quite interesting that they just transposed it. But then, obviously, one of the main issues is implementation, how able, and this is what Mark was talking about when he was talking about, you know, infrastructure and resources to actually implement this kind of agreement, because, you know, you do need the resources for data protection authorities. Then there's also the issue of costs for companies. One of the main criticisms of the GDPR is that it's very costly to enforce and implement at a firm level basis, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises. So given that in Africa, you tend to have a lot of small enterprises, especially in the high-tech field and digital field, is there a danger of imposing too large of a burden? But then one of the issues, and I think that's not really clear, is to what extent are countries whether in Africa or in other parts of the world adopting in a way data protection regimes that somehow are in line with their trade and economic interests. So if Francophone African countries obviously are very dependent on trade and investments from the European Union, especially France, then does that push them towards adopting this kind of realm, right? Whereas other countries, maybe in Central Asia or in Southeast Asia, if China obviously is their major trade partner, then to what extent is there pressure for them to kind of enter the Chinese realm? And, you know, to go back to what Mark said in his opening remarks, you know, how is it possible? To what extent can countries really stand on the sideline? Well, as long as the realms are not pushing them to enter, it's one thing. But, you know, if all of us, if we know more and more trade and investment are dependent on these data flows, that standing on the sideline becomes more and more difficult. And ultimately, does it mean that countries have to choose? Some countries is going to be easy. Benin said, you know, most of our business is with the EU, with France, and so we're just going to adopt the GDPR. You know, we'll have to see what the African Union is going to do. in terms of pushing. Is it going to push for something like the GDPR in a way as the EU has been following, sort of as the AU has been following the EU model? So that will be interesting to see. But given all these pressures, it's not clear that I think there's going to be kind of the realms will fight each other in other parts, whether it's Africa, whether it's in Asia, or even Latin America for that matter.
To pick up what Patrick and Mark said, I will offer two additional thoughts. One is the issue of cost. As both Mark and Patrick mentioned, Africa does face some deficit in terms of infrastructure. And China has long pursued a very, very long-term strategy in investing and building relations in Africa. And China's comparative advantage has been sort of state-facilitated development that lowered the cost for development of technology and distribution of those technology overseas. And Huawei, ZTE companies, these such companies have already been quite successful in Africa in distributing its technologies. So it has some sort of a first mover advantage. Second is the issue of trust. We've long been talking about this, and different data realms, EU or China or US, have pursued very different strategies, perhaps in relation to their relations with Africa. China historically has built very friendly relations in Africa. And this could be tested perhaps empirically, whether African nations have favorable opinions about China, US or EU. I mean, could be put to test, but China also now faces some backlash in the way it's pursuing its development strategies in Africa. Some call China sort of a new imperial power, and China considers somehow Africa as its second continent. And so these are mixed, I think, historical and contemporary elements that make China's relations with Africa a really complicated one.
Great. Thank you so much. Great discussion so far. We do have another very interesting question here from the audience. Could you please elaborate more on how we can ensure or facilitate cross-border data flow or interoperability of data governance systems among data realms that have different data governance regimes? What compromise could each government make, also given challenges we've seen these days, like the Schrems II decision? Could international trade instruments like regional trade agreements play a greater role? So cross-border data flows and interoperability given these different data governance regimes. Who'd like to jump in first here?
I'll gladly start. I think there's two parts of this question, right? One is what can trade agreements do amongst countries that by and large trust each other? And I want to say their trade agreements can do quite a lot, right? Because what trade agreements, and we're already starting to see this, right? Trade agreements are increasing the commercial flow of data. They're allowing for more interoperability. But a lot of the important work here is really what we've seen in other domains, whether it's food safety, industrial goods, and so forth. What trade agreements really can't anticipate, especially in a realm that's changing as quickly as the digital realm, what's going to change that. What trade agreements can do is to say, here's this other organization that handles it much more effectively through a set of standards. And what we will do is to have this be the default, right? But of course, you can deviate from this default. And there's a question of whether you want to do that, right, to say through the ISO, or whether you want to do that through as Susan touched on earlier, right, DIPA itself, which you could build these modules up yourself in the trade agreements, or things along those lines. But I think essentially there, you have to have a set of countries that essentially trust one another to say, yeah, you and I may disagree about exactly what type of competitive market structure we should have, or exactly what type of interoperability systems you want to have with regards to transfer of personal data across different platform providers. But these are technical issues we disagree on, but we share a common ideological commitment. And I want to say, I think this is largely with regards to liberal international economies, but you could also argue this also exists with regards to those who believe in a much more activist techno-surveillance state, right? So I think amongst these countries, there can be these types of bilateral agreements, and trade agreements can play quite a bit. Across countries that share differences on these fundamental visions, I think the elements to sort of reduce or to create the room for compromise have to come outside of trade agreement, and it comes to other areas such as what's going on with regards to cyber intrusions. What are we doing in terms of inspections or of private company events, actually trade secret theft, all of these other domains, right, which lead to growing mistrust, those need to get tempered down in order to create the room. So I think amongst those, the geopolitical tensions will reign supreme, and unfortunately, there won't be that much trade agreements can do.
Yeah, I'd like to respond
Great.
to Mark.
Go ahead. Yes, Susan and then Patrick. That would be great.
So let's just use AI as an example, and coming full terms to the points that I made about these technologies should be thought of as a global public good instead of a national treasure, and for which you have national champions. And so in trade agreements, there's language to facilitate AI, not in all trade agreements, but increasingly in digital trade chapters. There's language saying, you know, public data should be provided in a machine readable format, and it should be public and easily shared. But there isn't language on ethics. Why is that? Because that, again, is normative, and there isn't these shared notions of this. There also isn't language on apps. And why is that important? Because if the WeChat, TikTok situation hasn't taught us anything, it should have taught us that we need to not rely on private firms to police app stores and to say to app makers, and this is an international issue, and it has been since 2015, but to say to app makers that you should only use the data central to your function on the phone, central to the function of the app, not to, as a means of acquiring personal data to build new sectors or new services. This kind of thing, this is the future, I think, of trade agreements. And as Mark eloquently pointed out, where there is trust, you might find agreement. But honestly, you know, in our review of what's happened at the WTO using public communications, a paper that's going to come out soon from CG, if it passes the reviewers there. My boss at CG is, I think, in this conversation, so that's why I'm saying that. But no, I know it will. But in any case, interoperability was mentioned once, and interoperability once out of millions of words. So the question is, why is that not a top value? And that is just so weird to me. It's like the norms of the internet that were once accepted, such as interoperability of regimes and open free flow of data. All those things have gotten lost in the technology wars.
Great. Patrick, did you have some thoughts here?
Yeah. Well, to start with, you know, Susan just mentioned interoperability, and the fact that it's not really part of the WTO's discussion. But you know, from my view, and this is something I think that requires a lot more research. But it seems that, you know, a lot of people talk about interoperability, but no one really knows what it is and how it works. And I think every, you know, countries here in Canada, for instance, it's really the thing. You know, if you talk to government officials, they say, "Oh, well, we need to be interoperable with the EU and with the US, which are our two main, in a way, economic partners." But when you say, "Okay, well, what does that mean?" "Oh, we're working on it. We're working on it." But it's really not clear what interoperability looks like. Or, you know, it's a nice concept. Like, you want to be your regime to be able to work with another regime and all that. but to what extent is it possible and on what basis? Maybe on some more technical aspects, it is possible, as Mark mentioned. Certainly there's work focusing on actually trying to develop specific standards for data protection, for data governance. And that's one route that some are taking to really say, okay, well, if we have standards, if we can agree on standards, and then in that sense, it will make interoperability easier. But at the other end, to talk about trade agreements, right? We talked about the USMCA, we talked about the CPTPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Japan-US agreement. If we look at the e-commerce / digital trade chapters in there, what's interesting is you might say, well, they are interoperable, right? Because obviously the principle is that data has to be free to flow across borders, right? There should not be any impediments or restrictions on these data flows, except in the case of a legitimate public policy objective. So if a country is trying to pursue a legitimate public policy objective, then it's okay to impose restrictions, whether it's data localizations or other forms of restrictions, except that no one really defines what is a legitimate public policy objective. One could assume that if China were to join the CPTPP, its approach in terms of its data realms and having access to data and forcing data localization to firms would be entirely justified by the e-commerce chapter in the CPTPP, because it could claim, well, this is a legitimate public policy objective. And that kind of brings us back to a little bit where we started with Susan when she talks about national security, right? It's easy to invoke national security, and it seems to be invoked more and more to impose some kind of restrictions on trade flows. But then, the same logic applies obviously to data flows. But then to what extent do we separate between what is protectionism and what is really legitimate? And that kind of brings us back to, we need to define these things, and we can't certainly leave it to a panel of arbitrators in case of a dispute, 3 people basically deciding what is a legitimate public policy objective for a country to pursue. That brings us back to notions of democracy and sovereignty. So I think that's one of the most important thing if we're going to talk about interoperability, if we're going to talk about, okay, where do we allow things to flow and where can we say, no, those things can't flow? We need language, we need standards, we need something much more specific, except that right now, there is talk, but it's not clear where those discussions are happening. And they won't happen in the WTO because the WTO is not in the business of standard setting. So where is that going to happen? Which is why I've been kind of calling for some kind of data protection standards board or something like that internationally as part of a sort of single data realm that would help, in a way, resolve the data trilemma and achieve some of the things that Mark talked about at a more technical level. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. Min, did you want to add any remarks here? Or we can move on. Oh, you're muted.
I will add two ideas here. One is the data realm is complicated because it mixes the physical, network equipment realm with ideological realm, and it seems like it's really, really hard to separate these overlapping concepts and assets from each other. And WTO has long been in existence in China. China signed onto WTO around 2000, but for the longest time, China managed to block a lot of U.S. Apps and search engine, Google, for instance, Twitter, and Facebook on the basis of national security. So unfortunately, WTO is pretty toothless when it comes to governing these complicated realms.
Can I just comment on that?
Sure.
I don't, if I may, I don't think that's correct. Again, only because it is true that under social stability, right? They didn't do it under Article 21. It would be under Article 20. But whatever the rationale, right, it has to be challenged in a trade case. And so Mark was at USTR, and I'm not sure, Mark, if you were there in the time when Google and proposed, and then the Obama administration decided not to challenge the Great Firewall. And, you know, because it was a barrier to Google's entry in China. Now, since that time, there's been more and more discussion of this, but the United States also seems to have abandoned net neutrality, other things than an open internet, also pushed its approach, Section 230, in a trade agreement with Canada, which has led to lots of anger in Canada. So the question is, what role can the trade agreement play if nations, if it's not explicit regarding the governance of data, right? And there are lots of inconsistencies under the exceptions. That's thing point one that I want to make. And Mark would be more the expert on trade law than I am any day. So it will be great if he could comment on that. But the other point that I want to emphasize here is that data, in my mind, and let's see if everybody agrees, is something so different because yes, data can be traded when it is directly affiliated with a transaction. Hence, it should be under the trade regime. But when it is not, that is when the problem arises, right? So that there has never been a trade case related to disinformation, but you could see disinformation has totally undermined governments, whether that is the United States with COVID-19 or the UK with all sorts of rumors related to the economic impact of Brexit. So again, I think for goods and services, the trade regime has had a lot of time to adapt. But for data, right, yes, the WTO has governed data under software, no doubt about it, but not explicitly governed data. And so you need lots of cases to really understand what the trade law actually governs. So we need a little bit more time on that. And there is this huge question as to whether or not the WTO should govern data that is not affiliated with a transaction. And that often includes disinformation and other kinds of data. For example, when I first started working on data in 2011, we looked to see if malware was governable under the trade regime. I'll shut up now.
I'll just quickly jump in to the conversation here since Susan asked a question of me. First, the Google firewall issues came after I had already left government. So I wasn't directly involved in those conversations. Second, I think with the crisis that we see going on at the WTO right now, particularly with regards to dispute settlement and the interpretation of treaties, where essentially, right, the negotiating function or the legislative function of the WTO has not kept up to date with the technology. We are going to see that type of tension, and we've seen it play out in other realms besides data, that's essentially brought the dispute settlement function into, at least the appellate body, at least into some forms of a crisis. And those touch on issues of national security, they touch on issues of public order, and that's just with regards to, right, we're not even talking about data here, but I think this is a question that expands much more beyond data. It touches on the differences across these models of economic governance and even social ideological competition. And I think where the differences are that large, they can be mitigated if there's, I just want to come back to this theme over and over, right? Where there's trust in this third party institution to do so and thinks that it'll act adequately. But right now you don't have that trust. So whatever it takes to bridge that difference will make that happen. Then there's all these technical questions on the legal side, which really does require some fix if you don't want this done through an interpretive element of dispute settlement, including how do we think about, is it a data, is it good, what happens when what's a good, what's a service, what happens when these elements blend, there's, which actual line does this fall under, all these technical elements that the lawyers will gladly tell you, right, also need to be updated. But I think those don't matter. My point is here, those don't matter so much as that first order question can't be worked out. And where there is trust, there's a lot that can be done.
Okay, we just have a couple minutes here. We have one more audience question. I'm wondering if I can get one of you to just give a, minute response. The UK government is proposing to significantly reduce the rights of the individual when it comes to privacy and data protection, effectively going in the opposite direction to others. Does the panel have a view on the impact that this will have on trade? Does someone want to jump in just very quickly?
I can. I mean, I mentioned it a little bit in my opening remarks. I think this is a huge issue for the UK. And as I mentioned, if the UK doesn't have an agreement with the EU, which now looks like it might not as of January 1st, then it will be a little bit like in the US, in this kind of no person's land as of January 1st, where, especially financial services firm in London and other parts of the UK, huge part of the economy, technically, a lot of data actually flows. I mean, when they offer their services, they collect a lot of personal data from the EU right now. And if they can't do that legally, then that means that they would not be able to sell their services unless they actually had operations inside the EU. And in fact, now, both for the financial regulatory part, but also I think for the data part, you're seeing companies, financial institutions that they had already started moving some of their operations inside the EU, but I think we might see a lot more of that happening. One of the big issues, obviously, is what will the EU do or the UK after January 1st, right? If there is no agreement, will they just kind of let things be and no one will challenge those data flows? Or will someone actually say, the European Commission say, no, you can't flow these data across? It's actually illegal. The UK is not recognized as being adequate. So, financial institutions, for instance, in the UK will no longer be able to sell any services on data grounds, not on financial regulatory grounds. So I think this could be potentially a huge issue, and it will touch also a lot of other sectors as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time here, but I want to thank all of our panelists for a really fascinating discussion. Thank you to our hosts, the Geneva Trade Platform, and thank you so much to our audience for joining us today.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. This was great.